Well, it was very evident to me last week and then reinforced today that not only am I speaking to the choir, but I'm sitting with the choir in the same boat of dealing with life's grief. And gosh, this conversation, I could just say amen and we could wrap it up and go get breakfast. Just what a remarkable response to dealing with grief, others' grief, from this group today and last week. And I want to say thank you for your very gracious attention and reception to our conversation last week. It touched me very deeply. Kim looked at me as she came in this morning. She said, "So you're going to give us more grief?" That's a preacher for you. After class last week, question was raised, what's the difference between sudden death and prolonged, protracted end of life? And I have 4 brief reflections. Knowing someone is dying and their actual dying, are not the same thing. Knowing somebody is going to die and then that event actually occurring, those are not the same thing. They're poignantly connected but profoundly different. They're not the same reality. Prolonged death, end of life, offers potential for experiencing some of the meaningful gifts of sharing. The gifts of sharing at the end of life, such as a time to visit, to share affirmations, appreciations, like our 53-year-old son who died November 11th, 2020. The day he and his brother and their buddy sat in Spencer's home watching video games, eating barbecue, drinking beer, and doing a lot of BS. Time to address unfinished business. Offer appropriate "forgive me, I forgive you" messages. Time to say goodbye. I miss you. And or if you are ready to let go, it's okay. We'll miss you, we love you, but we'll be okay if you're ready to let go. That's what Kay and I and Kristen did with Spencer at his bedside. An hour or so later, he departed. If you're ready, it's okay. We love you, we miss you. We'll be okay. First time he ever listened to me. Sadly, a lot of folks miss out on the gifts of final sharing, unaware or uncomfortable with the conversation. Sometimes I've had families say, "Chaplain, we're not going to tell Dad how bad it is that he's dying. We don't want to upset him." Anybody ever hear that before? Or, "Chaplain, it looks like Chaplain, it looks like this is it. But don't tell my family. I don't want to upset them. I don't want to worry them. I don't want to hurt them." To these comments, I've learned sometimes to say to Dad, well, to the patient, "Well, sir, I hear what you're saying. It might be important for you to know your family's telling me the same thing about you." Or, "Well, I hear what you're saying. I understand. I appreciate what you're saying. You might want to know that Dad's telling me the same thing about you." Third, the degree of suffering may be a key difference. With sudden death, maybe there's less suffering than one who dies with a prolonged end of life, not only for them, but also for the family. Maybe. Terminally ill, injured folks live a lot longer than they want to. Sometimes I would hear somebody say, "Why doesn't God let me go? Why doesn't God call me home?" I don't see this as anybody giving up. I just see them at the point of being give out and letting go. I don't think people give up as much as we think, as much as they're just give out. I know this is where Mom was the last time I was with her. There is one common denominator between the two of them. They both suck. After class last week, Keenan Barnard told Kay and I about his brother being killed in a car wreck. I think it was like 1986. With permission, Keenan said, "I received a phone call from my father, and he told me about my brother. After our phone call, after I hung up the phone, I just sobbed. It's like someone just reaches into your heart, into your chest, and rips your heart out." Reminded me of the time I received a phone call from my older brother Elmer Jr., from Oregon, telling me that my father in Oregon had died, 1979. And I was in my office at the hospital, and I received this phone call, and Elmer tells me this. He tells me that the dad had gotten up that morning to go to get ready to go for his first radiation treatment back in the late 70s, early 80s, radiation treatment. And that he had gotten up to get ready to go to that radiation treatment. And he said Dad had a heart attack, fell back on his bed, and was gone. And I told my brother, "Well, Dad told me he didn't want to go to radiation." He told me that maybe 2 weeks earlier, when I was home for a week before he died, 2 weeks later. I thought, man, Dad didn't want to go. Keenan's imagery is similar to this illustration of grief. So we have two people. We, loved one. And grief is like, death is like somebody is ripped away, like Keenan said. And the grief process is a challenge for all of us. After we have had this experience, this excruciatingly painful experience of a loved one being ripped away, of somehow navigating our way through that event to where we become whole again. And in that process, we are left with scar tissue. And it's tender, but it's tough, and we're whole again in a whole new context. What do you think? Close? If we don't do this work, and we have lots of significant people that we care about and love. And, over time, they come, but we stay. It's always hard being the one left behind at some point. And if we don't do this work, and we have more losses, and we go through this again, I think you get the point. Why it's important for us. You begin to end up looking like and smelling like a piece of Swiss cheese. Pretty poignant illustration of grief. July 2016, Kay and I spent a week on the beach at Clearwater, Florida with our twin granddaughters from Texas, 9 years old at the time. We were with them and other less significant family. Kay and I were on a return flight when she handed me a magazine article and said, "Good article," entitled "An Accidental Friendship." Diane Penny's story of a chance encounter during a most traumatic time in her life. Diane lived in Nashville, Tennessee. Her son, Ryan, 20, was in Birmingham, Alabama, going into his sophomore year in Sigma Chi fraternity at Samford University in Birmingham. He was on a performing arts scholarship because of his theatrical, vocal, and most especially dancing talents. One summer morning, Ryan called Mom from Birmingham to let her know he and his girlfriend and her family were going water skiing. Before they hung up, Mom said to her son Ryan, "Be careful." "How did you know that? You guys are brilliant." 8 hours later, an ER nurse in Alabama informs Diane that Ryan had jumped off a 60-foot cliff into a lake, broke his back, and was paralyzed from the waist down. Mom lamented, "But he's a dancer. He's a dancer." Diane moved from her home in Nashville to an apartment in Birmingham to be with and help Ryan. She spent her days encouraging Ryan, investigating clinical trials, shopping, cleaning, doing laundry for Ryan, and struggling with the insurance company, which canceled their policy. Occasionally, Diane would stop at Whole Foods for dinner on the go. One October night, on her way out of Whole Foods, a little voice said, "Go back in and talk to someone." Sensing she needed someone to hear, "You have no idea what has happened to us," Diane went back in, returned to the grill, sat down with her styrofoam container of roast beef and salad. In short order, a blur of blonde hair and bling sat next to Diane with her husband. Her name was Susan Flowers, nicknamed Mermaid because she worked at SeaWorld. As they got acquainted, Susan asked Diane what had brought her to Birmingham. When Diane told her briefly about Ryan, Susan looked at Diane and said, with tears in her eyes, "You listen to me, girl. We are going to be best friends. You hear me? We're going to be best friends." Diane was amazed as the two women exchanged cell numbers. Soon after, Susan called and invited Diane to a small gathering at her home. Susan felt blessed to be included. A few weeks later, while folding Ryan's clothes, Diane had what is known in the South as a total come apart. Ever hear that? I never heard of that before. A total come apart. I hadn't heard that before, but I've been there. Done that. A total come apart. Fits in with what someone called last week about grief being a sneaky bitch. After her third sleepless night, Diane called Susan. When Susan answered, all Diane could do was sob on the phone. Susan simply said, Diane called Susan. Susan simply said, I'm on my way, and showed up in 20 minutes with a CD player and homemade soup. Diane collapsed on the couch thinking, Susan must be freaking out, a woman she hardly knew unraveling before her eyes. And then Susan said one of the bravest things Diane had ever heard. Diane, your sorrow doesn't scare me. And Diane sat on the floor as the CD filled the room with the story of Job and closed her eyes and slept. Was Kay right? Good article. Although Ryan will always need foot and leg braces, 14 months after his surgery, Ryan was able to walk hands-free without a walker or crutches. So Susan's flowers declaration, your sorrow doesn't scare me, struck me as a very poignant and powerful way to deal with grief, with others' grief. I don't know I would ever say your sorrow doesn't scare me to someone. First of all, it wouldn't be true. More like my fears of sorrow don't scare me as much as they used to. I'm less afraid of my fears, angst and discomfort, the loss, death, and grief of others and mine than I used to be. It's a world of difference between if I have my fears and my feelings and whatever the emotion might be, rather than that emotion has me. That will rock your world, a world of difference. Secondly, I just hope I can emulate mermaid spirit more often than not when I'm with others going through trauma, chaos, and grief. I wasn't there when I was attending Phillips Seminary in Enid, Oklahoma, and serving as a student pastor in a rural congregation, Drummond, Oklahoma, 15 miles south and east of Enid. 1965, 1969. In the 3.5 years I was there, I was looked upon to provide pastoral care and support in that congregation and community, and I did. But seldom did I feel comfortable, competent, or capable with home or hospital visits, with illness, trauma, loss, grief, crisis, funerals, hospital visits. My tipping point was when one of my youth group members, a 15-year-old, very bright, vibrant, beautiful young woman, was diagnosed with leukemia. Her father had died of cancer prior to my congregational call. Older brother and younger brother were also in the youth group. Mother was a church organist. Family were pillars of the congregation, respected in the community. Everyone in the community and congregation was traumatized with this young lady's diagnosis, and so was I. I would visit her at St. Mary's Hospital in Enid, the last hospital visit just before her death. When I saw her in the hospital bed, the edema was so disturbing, so painful, that instead of entering the room, And sitting at her bedside, I turned around and left St. Mary's Hospital. After she died, I visited Mom, brothers, others, and officiated her memorial service. I made bereavement calls with family and friends. I grieved her death and regretted bypassing her bedside. I decided at that point I needed to do something different or do something different. Something else. I'd already graduated from Phillips twice, Masters of Divinity and Theology, no more degrees to hide behind. So I applied for and was accepted for a CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education Chaplain Residency at some medical center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. First week of residency training, Chaplain Ben Patrick Jr., the first chaplain and CPE supervisor, 1964-1980, Ben hands each of us 4 male chaplain trainees a sheet of paper saying, "Okay, guys, here are your room assignments. You're responsible for pastoral care on these floors and units. Go visit these patients, their families, and their staff, and when you come back, we'll talk about it." Ben, you don't understand. I'm here because I don't feel comfortable, capable, or competent visiting folks in the hospital. Let's talk about that. Ben said, "Ron, you don't understand. Here are your room assignments. Go visit these people. And when you come back," and I thought I heard him say, "if you come back," like a deer in the headlights, "we'll talk about it." That was my introduction to clinical pastoral education. That in CPE, your classroom is the hospital bedside and corridors. Your teachers and curriculum are your patients, families, staff, and you. What CPE calls living human documents. Ourselves, others. Living human documents. Learning from folks and environment more than from books. Offering a profound prophetic opportunity and process to grow in pastoral care competency and identity formation. After about 4 to 6 months of CPE, it began to dawn on me that my barrier and difficulty and reticence about being with people in the hospital, out of the hospital, at the bedside, wherever, in crisis, trauma, grief, pain, as bad and sad as that can be and hard as that can be for them and for me, my real barrier was not that as much as my own in my life's journey that I hadn't faced and dealt with prior to going into ministry. That my past was contaminating and interfering with my present ministry. And through CPE, began to start this process of that no longer being the case, or it contaminated and interfered with and impeded my ministry, but began to illuminate and inform and sometimes even empower my ministry. I also came to experience a passion for, rather than anxiety, of hospital ministry and pastoral care. That offered a very profound, meaningful way to provide care to folks. That was very much a sacred privilege, being with folks at the bedside. John O'Donohue, a deceased Irish priest, philosopher, and author, wrote, "If you try to remove or avoid the awkward quality, it will pursue you. The only effective ways to still its unease is to transfigure it, to let it become something creative and positive that contributes to who you are." Richard Rohr, "If you don't transform your suffering, you transmit it." Insights for dealing with grief, the grief of others. Satir said, "We need to learn to be in others' pain without making their pain our pain, to become comfortable with uncomfortable things. This is a challenge, for fear demands we protect ourselves, but love asks us to go into painful places. The opposite of fear is not courage. The opposite of fear is compassion, putting others' needs or other needs ahead of our fears." Ram Dass was a leader and clinician with the Hahnemann Foundation Consciousness Dying Project, a foundation that started in Santa Cruz, California, and then moved to Taos, New Mexico. And I don't know how I got on their mailing list, but I received a newsletter from the Hahnemann Foundation, December 1979. And Ram Dass shared his experience working with folks who were terminally ill at the end of life, actively dying. And I found this article very meaningful and helpful in my 6th year as a professional chaplain. And I had been assigned to pediatrics, rehab center, oncology, and burn center for over 5 years. And I get this newsletter out of nowhere. In dealing with grief, others' grief, Dass says, we start out with our hearts open to others' pathos and keeping our hearts open to the suffering and sorrow that's around us. However, over time, we can become overwhelmed with our own pain and sadness, maybe even hopelessness, as we watch others over and over again go through their suffering and sorrow. Perhaps even to the extent we become depleted and emotionally shut down. Never forget the oncology nurse who told me once, after being with a family who had had a teenage daughter die, I went back to the unit, middle of the morning, dimly lit hallway. I still see her standing there, and I just asked her, "How do you all do this over and over again?" She said, "Well, you become like a stone." And that doesn't mean she was a good nurse and she was caring, but she just had to find some way to maintain. Sensing we have lost our tenderness and caring, after we do that, then Dass says, sensing we have lost our tenderness and caring, we open up once again. Open up again to the tender emotions, and then once again get lost in the sorrow and suffering of others. And so it goes on, cycle after cycle after cycle. Open up, overwhelmed, depleted, shut down, missing our tenderness, our care, our call, open up again. Depleted, shut down, missing, open up. Starting my 6th year as a board-certified chaplain, this article so resonated with me. This caregiver sequential cycle felt like it had been in my hip pocket for the past 6 years, if not longer. One day in the physician's lounge, a wonderful woman physician comes through the door into the lounge where the lunch table is. Just out of the blue says, "I'm out of compassion. I need a vacation." Sat down, visited, debriefed that some with me while we talked. And before we were through, at some point, I said to her, I was just so impressed with your awareness of your inner emotional landscape and how well you were able to be connected with that and articulate that. Having that emotional awareness. Father Henry Nouwen, in his book, The Wounded Healer, says, "Who can listen to a story of loneliness and despair without taking the risk of experiencing similar pains in his own heart and even losing his precious peace of mind? In short, who can take away suffering without ever entering it?" Over time, after going through this cycle over and over again, Das said he began to experience what he called an open heart and a quiet mind. An open heart and a quiet mind. True compassion is the blending of the open heart and the quiet mind. If you really want to help people, others who are suffering, you just have to develop the balance in which you keep your heart open and your mind quiet. Keep your heart open to the suffering that exists around you, such that you remain soft and flowing, and yet your mind quiet, simultaneously clear and spacious. It takes a good while to get the balance. Perhaps, as the scripture suggests, to be in it, but not of it. So about 30 years ago, it began to dawn on me that my biggest spiritual struggle in life had been learning to live life according to manufacturer's specifications. Learning to live life according to manufacturer's specifications rather than my limited expectations or ego or someone else's limited expectations or ego. And that much of my long-standing struggles with loss and suffering, others and mine, stem from my clinging to a model in my mind of how I would have made the world without suffering if I were God. Or how God should have made the world in the first darn place anyway, if there was a God. Learning to live life according to manufacturer's specifications rather than my limited expectation or limited perceptions, or someone else's limited expectations or limited perceptions. This has been essential for me in developing and sustaining an open heart and a quiet mind. An expectation is often a resentment or a disappointment waiting to happen. An expectation is often a disappointment or a resentment waiting to happen. Virginia Satir said, "Life is not what it's supposed to be. It's the way it is. The way you cope with it is what makes the difference." Harry Emerson Fosdick, "It's not what life brings to us in her hands that makes the difference. It is what life finds in us that counts." Someone said, "Life does not give us what we want. Life gives us who we are." Family Circle cartoon. little brother and sister, all bundled up, all pumped out, going outside. Sis says, it was really windy yesterday, but today it's nice and calming. Family circle must live in Oklahoma. It was really windy yesterday, but today it's nice and calming. Lu Yu was born in China in the year 773, considered to be the sage of tea for his knowledge and skills in cultivating, making, and brewing tea, and for his book, The Classic Tea. I'm considering this to be my funeral benediction. The clouds above us join and separate. The breeze in the courtyard comes, leaves, and then it returns. The breeze in the courtyard leaves, and then it returns. Life is like that. So why not relax? Who can keep us from celebrating? Manufacturer's specifications. I'm curious about how and what Susan Mermaid Flowers' Job CD spoke to Diane Penny in her Total Come Apart. Job was a man of affluence and influence in the land of Uz. He is portrayed as pure, upright, reverent, and respected. Job had 10 children, 3 daughters and 7 sons, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. I guess male asses don't count. I think I hear an amen there. Amen there. Job had a very great household, was considered the greatest of all people in the East. Nonetheless, a day from hell hit Job. First, he learns a band of Sabians, southern Arabia, now Yemen, rustled his oxen and donkeys and killed all of his servants. Then Job is informed of the fire of God falling from heaven, incinerating all of his sheep and shepherds. Might have been lightning strike, meteorite, volcanic eruption. Next, Job learns a tribe of Chaldeans, semi-nomadic tribe from southern Babylon, now part of southern Iraq, took all of his camels and killed all the servants. Lastly, Job is told his sons and daughters were having a family feast in the oldest brother's home when a great wind swept across the wilderness, struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they all died. Maybe a tornado, maybe a hurricane. And it's hard to read that and not think about what we see going on, not only in Ukraine, but other places in the world. After all this that Job went through, had endured, he was afflicted with a malignant ulcer from the sole of his feet to the top of his head. A burning sore, possibly one boil over his entire body. A form of black leprosy or elephantitis. One universal inflammation, maybe scurvy or smallpox. Whatever it was, Job took a shard of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Some time ago, I had a small cut on my finger. I was cleaning out the ashes out of a wood-burning firebox in our family room, and some of the ashes got in that little cut. I was amazed at how painful that was. And when I read that scripture, I always think about that. Job had endured the death of 10 children, loss of worldly possessions, health. Both he and his wife were so distraught, his wife admonished him to curse God and die. And in chapter 3, verse 1, we read, Job cursed the day he was born. In chapter 2, we are told, when Job's 3 friends heard about all this calamity and tragedy that had happened to him, each of them came from his own country. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. And they made an appointment to find Job together to console and comfort him. They were on a mission to deal with Job's grief, to console and comfort him. When they found Job, they saw him from afar, and they did not recognize him. They gazed intently at Job from a distance, but did not recognize him. This is so real. How many times have you heard or even said, they didn't look like themselves? I barely recognized them. Last time I got a haircut, my barber told me, I lost my oldest son Saturday night from cancer. Last time I saw him, he was skin and bones. And my barber knew about our son. And it was like two fathers grieving. What Pamela Cooper Wright, pastoral care seminary professor, theologian, Union Seminary, calls shared sacred space. Next, Job's friends began to weep loudly. Each of them tore his robes, and they threw dust in the air over their heads. Ancient Hebrew bereavement rites and rituals. They went to find him. They found him. They saw him. They grieved with him. They empathized with Job. They felt sorrow with Job. They felt sorrow, not pity for him. Felt his pain without making his pain their pain. And then in Job 3:13, an amazing thing happens. Just an amazing, phenomenal thing happens next. We are told Job's 3 friends sat in silence for 7 days and 7 nights, for they saw how great his grief was. They sat down with Job on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights. No one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his pain was great. Apparently Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar weren't preachers. You get a preacher started, it's hard to get them to stop. Job's 3 friends reached out to Job. They showed up and they shut up. Dealing with grief, others. Reach out, show up. In the late 1970s, Rabbi Harold Kushner at a Hillcrest Physicians Breakfast said to these docs, "This is what I recommend we do and say. When bad things happen to people, what I recommend we say is, 'I'm sorry,' and shut up." In dealing with others' grief, Doug Banning, Don't Take My Grief Away From Me, suggests, first and foremost, we need to get in other people's buckets. That's what Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar did with Job. They got in Job's bucket. Let's say this bucket represents Job's feelings. And Job has had all of this calamity and tragedy come upon him. This represents his feelings. The loss of his 10 children, one fell swoop. loss of his marital stability, servants, herds, livestock, herders, health. Job's feelings, other people's feelings when they are hurting and grieving. Such as, what's in this bucket? Feelings. Sadness. Anger. Amen. Regret. Denial. Disbelief. Depression. Bargaining. Frustration. Remorse. Loneliness. Guilt. Disorientation. Despair. Pain. Fear. Agony. Anxiety. All kinds of feelings. Lots of feelings in this bucket. In their bucket. Not only things, but thoughts. All kinds of thoughts. Why? Why me? Why my loved one? My marriage, my child, my job, my resources, my world. Why? Why have you forsaken me? No. No. Not me. Not. Where was God? Where is God? Is there a God? If there was a God, God wouldn't take this cup away from me. All kinds of feelings and thinking that comes with catastrophic loss. How will I survive? Will I survive? I don't want to survive. Who will take care of me? What happened to me? Who am I now? Why don't I hear from my family, from my friends? And what important thing does all these thoughts and feelings tell us about this bucket? This bucket is what? It's full and overflowing. When others are grieving, this bucket, their bucket, is full and overflowing. And the reality is, there's another bucket. Whose bucket is this? This is our bucket. It's what? It's full of what? Lots of things. Lots of things. Some of the same stuff that's in this bucket. All of our thoughts and all of our feelings. All kinds of advice in our bucket. Clever sayings, words of wisdom, inspirational insights, profound platitudes, scripture, inspirational quotes, encouraging words to get them through and beyond to move on. Our accountability agenda. This happened for a reason. God has a reason. Shortly after 9/11, several internationally respected religious leaders were asked to comment on their faith beliefs related to 9/11. And Rabbi Harold Kushner said, "This is not a time for theologizing. This is a time for grieving." The positive spins on what happened are in this bucket. And I've got this song that Iris Dement sings. Mike saw it when he came in this morning, Mike Moore. He said, "Ron, I see that song. I read it, don't sing it." Good advice. Don't pick on him, Leslie. We both know the reason. I'll take my sorrow straight. We both know the reason why you've called. So stop wasting time trying to soften up my fall. I know you want to sweeten up the taste, but if you don't mind, I'll just take my sorrow straight. You almost make it seem like something nice, the way you take your bad news and pour it over ice. That's a kindness I don't appreciate, because I like to take my sorrow straight. I wouldn't say that I'm stronger than the rest, but no matter what you say, it ain't gonna hurt me any less. Because in the end, there's really no escape, so I just go on and just take my sorrow straight. So I've got copies of this here for folks who would like it. And there's also copies from the handout from last week if you didn't get one, or want another one. Naturally, we want folks to feel better. We want to make them better and feel better because we care about them. And we want to make them feel better. And because we want to do that, we are at risk for what? For pouring what's in our bucket into their bucket. And the problem with that is what? This bucket is what? And overflowing. There's no place for this, especially at this time. Maybe judiciously later, but not now. Sometimes what's in our bucket is we're scared of what's in their bucket. Sometimes within their bucket scares us because what if they cry? And we might not know how to get them to stop crying. Sometimes when people say to me, I'm sorry, I told myself I wasn't going to do this, I wasn't going to cry. I occasionally, judiciously respond, no need to apologize, it looks like good healthy snot to me. But sometimes when people say, I'm afraid if I start crying, I won't stop crying. And I say, well, maybe so. But my experience has been, tears stop when they're all out. And it might take a long time to thaw out some of those frozen tears and get them all out. Sometimes people say, I never cry about this. I never cried about this. I never cried about Dad. I never cried about Mom. And I've learned to say, sometimes, not on the outside. Helping when others are hurting, grieving, always begins by getting in their bucket with them. Be with them in their pivotal moments, not merely at their pivotal moments. Sitting with people in their bucket, often in silence, listening. It helps people go through and out of despair and into repair. Hurt has to be heard in order to be healed. Being hurt is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. Real quick and in closing. On call one night, called into the hospital. Patient in the extended care unit had gone bad. And family was coming from Tahlequah, and family was there, and the staff wanted me to come and be with the family. I get up to the floor, elevator door opens, and there's a young lady and the daughter and her uncle, the brother. And I'm assuming this is the family. I introduced myself and asked them if they are part of this woman's family, and say yes, and they're on their way. She's been transferred from the extended care unit over to the intensive care in the burn unit. And I offered to escort them over there if they would like me to do so, and they said yes. We go over there. I assist them getting into the unit, meeting with the mother's sister's nurse, and they get an update from the nurse. So we're sitting in the waiting area. Mom's in the burn ICU, sister's in the burn ICU, daughter, one end of the couch, uncle next to her, and I'm over here sitting. Looks like the daughter may be about ready to go to sleep. I offered to have prayer, and they asked, and they want that there's family coming in from Tahlequah. They're waiting for them to come. So I offer prayer for their mom, for them, safe trip for the family, for the mom's healing, well-being. And then it looks like the daughter's just about to go to sleep, maybe even. And the brother's sitting there, just looking down at the carpet. So I sit there. Finally, he looks up and he looks at me and says, "You here all night?" And I go, "Sometimes." He looks back down at the carpet, looks back out and looks at me and says, "To help people?" And I said, "I hope so." He looked back down at the carpet. A moment later, he looks back up. He says, "Well, it works." It went in my core. It works. Thank you.